The village of Thornmere lay nestled in the shadow of the high stone hills, a quiet hamlet untouched by time and seemingly unremarkable in every way. Farmers tilled their fields, artisans plied their trades, and laughter filled the air as children ran through the cobbled streets. Yet beneath this peaceful surface, whispers of unease had begun to spread. It started with strange sights in the hills, shadows that moved without cause, whispers carried by the wind, and a deep, bone-shaking rumble that came in the dead of night. Some said it was a storm gathering in the distance. Others whispered of something darker. Among those who called Thornmere home, 7 strangers arrived over the course of a week, each carrying their own mysteries. Kada, the steadfast shield maiden, was the first to appear. She stood in the square as the market bustled around her, her presence as solid as the iron shield strapped to her back. Villagers whispered about the strange shimmer that seemed to dance across its surface in the sunlight. Though she answered their curious questions politely, her eyes lingered on the hills, scanning for dangers unseen. Lyra the mage came at dusk the following day. She towered above the villagers, her robes billowing around her like a storm cloud. Her runed staff tapped softly against the cobblestones, the faint hum of magic trailing behind her. Despite her imposing stature, she moved with measured grace, her voice calm and deliberate as she sought lodging and kept her secrets close. Dane, the dragon-scarred knight, arrived the next morning, his armor worn but unyielding, his blade sheathed across his back. He carried himself with the confidence of one who had faced monsters before. He said little to the townsfolk, though his sharp gaze lingered on the younger men and women, as if weighing their strength and resolve. When asked his business, he merely replied, "I'm hunting something." No one dared ask what. Kale's arrival went almost unnoticed, exactly as he intended. The rogue slipped into town in the twilight, his dark cloak melting seamlessly into the shadows and vanishing from sight even when gazed directly upon. While others sought shelter openly, Kale found his way to the cellar of the tavern, where a loose board beneath the counter allowed him to eavesdrop on the villagers' growing fears. When he finally emerged, it was with a mischievous grin and a coin pouch that hadn't been his the night before. The next morning, the town square fell silent as Rordan arrived. The skeletal figure shuffled into view with measured, almost regal steps. His robes, once opulent, were now tattered and frayed, hanging loosely over a body that defied reason. Bones, yellowed with age and covered in sinew, and patches of leathery flesh creaked with every movement. Ligaments, impossibly holding him together, stretched grotesquely as he leaned upon his staff. The staff itself, capped with oversized green stones that pulsed faintly, seemed to exude a life of its own, casting a sickly glow that both repelled and mesmerized the villagers. Children hid behind their mothers, their eyes wide, filled with terror as they clung to skirts. Even the bravest among the villagers instinctively stepped back, their hands trembling as they gripped whatever talismans or tools they could find. A wave of uneasy silence swept through the square, broken only by the dry, raspy rattle of Rordan's breath, a sound far too alive for something so close to death. And then he spoke. His voice, incongruously warm and rich, carried the humor of a man who had seen countless years pass and had made peace with his dreadful state. "Fear not," he said, his skeletal grin wide, the corner of his lips clinging sharply to his jaw. "I'm mostly harmless." For a moment his hollow eye sockets seemed to twinkle, as though some remnant of his soul burned within them. And though no muscle remained upon his face, The tilt of his head had a ghostly flicker of motion suggesting a wink. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to disarm a few of the villagers who, despite themselves, found nervous smiles tugging at their lips. For those who dared look closer, the green glow of his staff seemed more menacing than Rodan himself. The stones pulsed faintly as if feeding off the air around them, and the faint hum they emitted was almost musical, a dirge that whispered of both life and death. The villagers could not know the truth, that the staff was both his salvation and his curse, draining what little remained of his corporeal form each time he wielded its power. But for now, they saw only a monster who carried himself like a man, and Rodan's secret remained his own. 2 more arrived before week's end. Corin the healer wore the simplest of garments, his satchel of herbs slung over his shoulder. While his kind smile reassured many, his gaze carried the weight of a man who had seen too much suffering. He knelt by the wounded without hesitation, his hands quick and steady as he worked his craft. And then there was Elric, who had always been part of Thornmere. The lanky young man hadn't sought this strange gathering. He had stumbled into it, drawn by a curiosity he couldn't explain. His clumsy attempt to eavesdrop on their plans had nearly earned him a dagger in the dark from Kale, but instead it earned him an invitation, or perhaps a warning, from Kata. "You're in this now, whether you like it or not," she had said, her tone leaving no room for argument. As the 7 strangers converged, the air in Thornmere grew heavy. The villagers whispered about the signs, the strange lights in the hills, the unnatural quiet in the forest, and the distant rumble that shook the ground at night. The strangers, each burdened with their own purpose, knew their meaning was no coincidence. Something ancient stirred in the shadows, and whatever it was, threatened to break the fragile peace of the world. Unlikely allies, bound by fate, the 7 stood at the crossroads of a journey none of them fully understood. And as the sun set over Thornmere, its golden light fading into darkness, the first steps of their shared destiny began. The night had fallen heavy over Thornmere, the village silent except for the occasional creak of wood or the distant hoot of an owl. The air carried an oppressive weight, thick and humid, as if the world held its breath. The 7 strangers, scattered across the village, were each restless, their unease growing as the minutes ticked by. It began with a low rumble, almost imperceptible at first, like the distant growl of a storm. Then came the tremors. The ground shuddered, causing shutters to rattle and lanterns to sway. Villagers emerged from their homes clutching cloaks and squinting into the darkness. From the hills beyond Thornmere, a shadow rose against the sky, vast and undulating, as if the darkness itself had taken form. Crimson lights flared within it, fiery eyes that burned with malevolence. The villagers gasped and retreated, murmurs of fear spreading like wildfire. "It's here," Kata said, her voice low but steady. She stood in the center of the square, shield in hand, her gaze fixed in the approaching shadow. Lyra joined her, the runes on her staff flickering to life as she muttered an incantation. "It's bigger than I expected," the mage admitted, her calm tone belying the tension in her posture. "What is it?" Elric stammered, having trailed nervously after the others. His question went unanswered as the shadow crested the ridge, revealing its full form. The archfiend was enormous, its body a swirling mass of darkness, punctuated by jagged molten spikes. Its 4 massive legs crushed trees with every step, and its claws tore into the earth as it descended toward the village. A roar erupted from its maw, shaking the very foundations of Thornmere. "By the gods," Corrin whispered, his usually steady hands trembling as he gripped a simple dagger. "What can stop that?" "Us," Dane said, drawing his blade with metallic hiss. The knight stepped forward, his dragon-scarred armor gleaming faintly in the moonlight. "Get the villagers to safety. Leave the beast to me." "You think you can take it alone?" Kale asked, perched on a low rooftop with a throwing knife spinning idly in his fingers. "You'll need more than that oversized toothpick." "Then help," Kata snapped. Striding toward Dane, she slammed her shield into the ground, its edge glowing faintly as it activated some hidden enchantment. "Or stay out of the way." "Enough talk," Lyra interjected, her staff raised high. "It's upon us." The archfiend roared again, its molten claws gouging the earth as it lunged toward the square. Kata planted her feet, raising her shield as the creature's massive claws came crashing down. The impact sent shockwaves through the ground, but the shield held, its enchantment flaring brightly. "Move!" Kata shouted as the beast reared back for another strike. Lyra unleashed a torrent of fire from her staff, flames licking at the archfiend's shadowy form. The beast recoiled, roaring in fury as the fire seared its molten spikes. Dane charged forward, his blade slicing through one of its legs in a shower of dark ichor. But the wound closed almost instantly. "It's regenerating," Corrin shouted from the sidelines, pulling a wounded villager to safety. "Then we need to keep it busy," Kale said, leaping from his perch to land nimbly beside Kata. He hurled a throwing knife that struck one of the creature's glowing eyes, causing it to shriek in pain. "Eyes are almost always a weak point," he grinned. Near the chaos, Rordan stood calmly, his skeletal frame outlined by the emerald glow of his staff. He muttered an incantation. The green tendrils of energy snaked from the staff, wrapping around the archfiend's legs. The creature struggled, its movement slowing as Rordan's magic took hold. "Now!" Rordan bellowed. "Strike while it's bound!" Dane and Kata moved as one, their combined attacks severing one of the beast's front legs. The archfiend collapsed, its body writhing as it lashed out blindly. Shadows erupted from its wounds, coiling toward the group like living tendrils. Elric, frozen at the edge of the square, watched in horror as one of the tendrils arched toward him. He stumbled backwards, fell to the ground, and raised his arms in a futile attempt to shield himself. But before it struck, Kata's shield deflected the blow. "Get up!" she shouted, pulling him to his feet. "I told you before, you're part of this now, whether you like it or not." Perhaps she saw something in him that he never had. Elric nodded shakily, grabbing a discarded sword from the ground, probably the same one that tripped him moments earlier. It felt awkward in his hands, as if it were laughing at him, but he followed Kata back into the fray, swinging clumsily at the shadows that swirled around them. The archfiend's roars grew more frantic as the group pressed their attack. Lyra conjured a lightning storm, each bolt striking the beast with unrelenting force. Kale darted in and out of the shadows, his knives finding their marks with precision. Dane delivered crushing blows with his blade, while Rordan's magic sapped the creature's strength. Finally, Corrin stepped forward, his voice raising in a chant. He cast a blessing over the group, their weapons glowing faintly as his magic amplified their strikes. All the weapons, that is, except Elric's sword. Instead, his body glowed as brightly as the others' weapons. With a final coordinated effort, Dane drove his sword deep into the archfiend's chest as Lyra unleashed a blast of energy that shattered the creature's molten core. Elric swung his sword, but the strength of the blow seemed to originate from him rather than the blow of the weapon. The archfiend let out a final deafening roar before collapsing into a heap of ash and shadow. Then it was gone, wisps of smoke vanishing into the breeze. The square fell silent, save for the heavy breathing of the 7 strangers and soft murmurs from hidden bystanders. That was... Elric began, his voice shaking. Only the beginning, Rodan said grimly, his staff dimming as the emerald glow faded. This creature was a servant, not the master. What little flesh remained on his bones seemed to shrink and tighten against his bones. Lyra nodded, her expression dark. True power lies elsewhere. This was merely a test. As the villagers emerged cautiously from their homes, the seven exchanged glances. The Archfiend's attack had bound them together in battle, but the greater challenge lay ahead, somewhere in the shadows. The real enemy waited and was watching. The group stood amidst the ruins of Thornmere Square, the air heavy with the acrid scent of sulfur and ash. Though the Archfiend had been vanquished, its presence lingered like a stain on the land. Villagers whispered prayers and huddled together, their eyes flickering between the strange band of heroes and the scorched earth left behind. We need answers, Kata said, her voice cutting through the uneasy silence. She wiped soot from her shield, her brow furrowed in thought. That thing didn't attack without purpose. Someone, or something, is controlling these forces. It's him, Rodan said flatly, leaning heavily on his staff. His glowing green eyes dimmed slightly as he seemed to sag under the weight of his words. Nevermore. Elric's gaze darted toward the skeleton. The Oathbreaker? But isn't he just a story, a legend to frighten children? Rodan turned his hollow gaze to Elric, the humor that usually colored his voice absent. Stories have roots in truth, boy. Nevermore was real and far more dangerous than any child's tale could ever capture. The group gathered in town's abandoned meeting hall as Rodan began to recount the tale. The firelight flickered against the worn walls, casting long shadows as the skeletal mage spoke. Nevermore was once the protector of Elendor, Rodan said, his voice low and even. Bound by oath to defend the land from all threats, he was a hero of unmatched power and resolve. But heroes are not immune to weakness. Lyra nodded, her runes glowing faintly as she listened. The betrayal. It's written in the histories. Nevermore made a pact with a necromancer, didn't he? Yes, Rodan confirmed, his skeletal fingers tightening on his staff. The necromancer promised him the power to save Elendor from an encroaching darkness, but it was a lie. The power corrupted him, twisting his purpose. He broke his sacred oath, and with it, the very balance of the land. Dane leaned forward, his scarred armor glinting in the firelight. What happened to him? No one knows for certain, Rodan replied. Some say he vanished into the shadows, consumed by the power he unleashed. Others claim he was sealed away, his punishment for unleashing chaos upon the world. But this attack, he gestured toward the window, where smoke still rose from the square, proves he's stirring again. And the necromancer? Kata asked, her tone sharp. If they're the one who started all this, are they still out there? Likely, Rodan said, his voice grim. And worse, they may be the one pulling the strings. Wonderful, Kale muttered, leaning back in his chair with his feet on the table. So let me get this straight. We've got a corrupted legend and an ancient necromancer to deal with. Sounds like a death sentence. It's more than that, Lyra said, her expression serious. If Nevermore's power grows unchecked, it won't stop with Thornmere. The entire land will fall. Elric shifted uncomfortably. But why us? Why are we the ones who have to stop it? Shouldn't this be a job for kings and armies? Kings and armies don't deal with shadows, Dane said, his voice like steel. They crumble under them. Kata stood, her shield resting on the table. The attack on Thornmere wasn't random. The Archfiend came here for a reason. If we follow the trail, it will lead us to the source, and to Nameless. The source will be where he fell, Rodan said, his hollow voice tinged with unease. A place hidden in the depths of Wyrmsreach forest, the site of the broken oath. A heavy silence fell over the group. The Wyrmsreach was a place of myth and dread, its dense woods rumored to be haunted by all manner of creatures. Few who entered its depths ever returned. We'll need supplies, Korn said, breaking the silence. The healer's voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed his worry. And a plan. And courage, Lyra added, her gaze settling on each member of the group. A great deal of it. Good thing I've got plenty, Kale said with a grin, though the others could hear the unease behind his bravado. Elric hesitated, the weight of their task pressing heavily on him. He had never intended to be part of something so grand, so dangerous, but he looked around the room at the others, their resolve, their weariness, their determination. He felt the faint stirrings of courage. Perhaps he was not as prepared as they were, but he was here, and that had to count for something. Wyrmsreach, then, Dane said, standing and gripping his sword. Let's see if legends can bleed. As the group dispersed to prepare for their journey, Rodan lingered by the fire, staring into the flames. Elric paused, watching the skeletal mage for a moment before speaking. Do you think we really can stop him? Elric asked quietly. Rodan didn't look up. I've been alive long enough to know one thing, boy. Nothing is ever truly stopped, but if we're lucky, we might delay it, and sometimes that's enough. With that, Rodan turned and walked into the shadows, his staff glowing faintly as he disappeared into the night. Elric stood alone for a moment, the words sinking into him, before heading out into the cold to join the others. Tomorrow their path would take them to the heart of Wyrmsreach, and into the depths of an ancient, broken promise. The Wyrmsreach forest loomed before them, its massive trees twisting together like the bars of a prison. Thick mists clung to the ground, swirling around their boots as the group entered the ancient woods. No birds sang here, no wind rustled the leaves. Only silence greeted them, broken occasionally by the crunch of dead foliage beneath their feet. This place feels wrong, Elric murmured, gripping the hilt of his borrowed sword. His eyes darted nervously from shadow to shadow, like it's watching us. It probably is, Kale quipped, his voice low as he moved lightly along the forest edge. Places like this tend to have a personality, and this one, very unfriendly. Enough chatter, Dane said, his blade glinting in the faint light that filtered through the canopy. We stay focused. The veil lies deeper within. The veil? Elric asked, glancing at Rodan. The skeletal mage walked near the front of the group, his glowing staff casting eerie green light on the trees. What is it? Rodan's hollow voice answered, calm and deliberate. The veil is the boundary between Elendor and the Shadow's domain. It's where Nameless fell, and where the oath was broken. And it's what protects the Shadow's heart, Lyra added, her voice steady despite the unease in her eyes. No mortal has passed beyond it in centuries. Then how do we get through? Corrin asked, adjusting the strap of his satchel. With blood, Rodan replied grimly. The veil demands a toll. Elric's stomach twisted. toll? What kind of toll? You'll find out soon enough, Rodan said, his tone making it clear that he would say no more. The deeper they ventured into Wyrmsreach, the darker the forest grew. The trees seemed to close in around them, their twisted branches forming grotesque shapes that clawed the sky. The air grew cooler, the faint whispers that had begun as they entered grew louder, more insistent. Do you hear that? Kata asked, her shield held high as her eyes scanned the darkness. It's not your ears you're hearing with, Rodan said. The veil calls to us. It wants us to turn back. Not likely, Dane growled. His armored boots crushed the undergrowth with resolute steps. I've come too far to be scared off by voices. But as they pressed on, even Dane's resolve began to waver. The whispers grew clearer, taking the form of words, accusations, pleas, and screams that echoed off from the depths of each hero's soul. Elric froze as a voice called his name, soft and familiar. Elric, it whispered, barely audible above the wind. He turned, his heart racing. He saw a faint figure in the mist. A young girl, her hair flowing like a river of light. Mara? He whispered, stepping toward the apparition. Don't! Kata barked and grabbed his arm, yanking him back. The figure dissolved into mist, its features twisting into something monstrous before fading away entirely. It's not real. The veil uses your memories against you. Whatever you see or hear, keep moving, Lyra added, her runes flaring as she muttered a protective incantation. The veil will try to break us. After what felt like hours, the group came upon a clearing. At its center stood a massive archway formed of ancient stone, carved with runes that pulsed faintly with crimson light. The archway shimmered, its interior filled with a swirling black mist that seemed to stretch into infinity. The veil, Rodan said, his tone reverent. Beyond lies the shadow's domain. As the group approached, the ground beneath the arch began to glow, and a deep, resonant voice echoed from the stone. Who dares seek passage? Step forward, Rodan said, his voice low. It demands the toll. One by one, the group approached the arch. Dane stepped forward first, his broad shoulders squared. The glow beneath his feet flared, and the voice spoke again. What do you offer, Dragon Slayer? Dane's jaw tightened. My strength, he said simply. The light dimmed, and the voice responded. Accepted. Kale approached next, his movements cautious. The glow returned, and the voice asked, What do you offer, Shadow Walker? Kale hesitated, his usual bravado faltering. My loyalty, he said at last. Accepted. One by one, the others stepped forward, each offering something deeply personal. Lyra gave her knowledge, Corin his compassion, Kata her unyielding resolve. When it was Elric's turn, his legs felt like lead. He stepped into the glow, his breath shallow, and the voice addressed him. And you, unmarked one, what do you offer? Elric swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had no grand strength like Dane, no magical knowledge like Lyra. What could he possibly offer? My courage, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The light flared brighter than before. Accepted. As the group gathered before the veil, the voice spoke one final time. You may pass, but know this. What lies beyond will claim a part of you. Step through, and you are no longer what you were. Rodan was the last to approach. The voice hesitated before speaking. And you, One who is neither living nor dead? What do you offer? Rordan chuckled, his tone dry. I offer what I have left, my purpose. The glow dimmed, and the voice fell silent. Together, the seven stood before the veil, their resolve hardening. One by one, they stepped through, the swirling mist swallowing them whole. On the other side, the world was stark contrast to the Wyrmsreach. The ground was barren and cracked, the sky a swirling mass of black and crimson. In the distance, a massive citadel rose, its jagged spires piercing the sky like claws. "This is it," Rordan said, his voice heavy. "The Shadow's domain." As the group pressed forward, Elric felt the warmth of the blade at his side, a faint reassurance in the oppressive landscape. The veil was behind them, but the true battle lay ahead. And somewhere in the distance, a shadow watched. The Shadow's domain stretched before them in a bleak and lifeless expanse, the barren ground cracked like the dried skin beneath their feet. The air was thick, each breath labored as if the very atmosphere rebelled against their presence. The citadel loomed ahead, an immense monolith of obsidian and iron, its spires writhing like frozen smoke. It seemed alive, pulsing faintly, with a rhythm that matched the oppressive thrum of the land itself. "It's worse than I imagined," Lyra said, her voice steady but low, as if afraid to wake the shadows that clung to every crevice. "What did you expect?" Kale muttered, his tone laced with unease. "Flowers and sunshine?" "Quiet!" Kata snapped, her shield raised as her eyes scanned the desolate horizon. "We're exposed here." Rordan stopped suddenly, his staff glowing faintly. The others turned to him, waiting for an explanation. "The sepulchre is near," he said. His hollow voice carried a weight of sorrow. "We're about to step onto hallowed ground, or what's left of it." "The sepulchre?" Elric asked, keeping his voice low. "What is it?" "The place where Nevermore broke the oath," Rordan replied, his skeletal hand tightening around his staff. "It's not just a tomb, it's a wound the land itself remembers." The terrain grew harsher as they pressed on. The cracked earth gave way to jagged rocks that jutted from the ground like broken teeth. Shadows moved in the periphery, but they were not creatures, not entirely. Flickering figures of light and smoke seemed to reenact battles from another time, their ethereal cries echoing in the still air. "These are echoes," Rordan explained as one spectral warrior swung a blade that passed through Dane harmlessly. "Fragments of the past, trapped in the moment of Nevermore's betrayal." Ahead, the rocks opened into a wide chasm, its edges jagged and sharp. At the center of the chasm lay the sepulchre, a massive altar of cracked stone surrounded by the remnants of ancient pillars. The area radiated a deep crimson light, pulsing faintly like a dying heartbeat. "This is where it happened," Rordan said, his voice quieter now, "where Nevermore made the pact." The group approached cautiously, the weight of the place pressing heavily on them. As they drew closer, they saw the markings carved on the altar, symbols of protection, unity, and balance, defaced with jagged lines that bled shadow. At the center of the altar lay a broken sword, its hilt blackened and its blade shattered. "That's his," Dane said grimly, nodding toward the sword. "The Oathbreaker's blade." Elric stepped closer, feeling the warmth in his chest intensify. The broken sword seemed to pull at him, as though it recognized something within him. He reached out, but Rodan's voice stopped him. "Don't touch it," the mage warned. "The blade still carries the weight of his betrayal. It would consume you in an instant." Elric withdrew his hand, though the pull of the sword still lingered. He clenched his fists, frustration and curiosity warring within him. "There has to be a way," he murmured, almost to himself. The warmth in his chest pulsed again, stronger this time, and he gasped softly. He realized then that it wasn't the sword that was calling him, but something within himself. "Elric, step back," Kata said firmly. "We don't know what that thing could do to you." But Elric couldn't move. The warmth in his chest spread, filling him with a strange mixture of fear and resolve. The shadows around the altar seemed to twist and coil toward him, and for a brief moment, he felt as though he were standing in two places at once. He saw flashes of Naemor's life, the oath sworn in blood, the betrayal that shattered him, and the shadow that consumed him. "I can't leave it here," Elric said, his voice trembling but determined. He looked at Rodan. "There has to be a way to take it without letting it destroy me." Rodan hesitated, his skeletal face unreadable. Then he nodded slowly. "The blade is broken," he said. "Its power is fractured, but not gone. If you're willing to bear its burden, there's a way, but it will cost you." "What cost?" Lyra said sharply. "The shadow doesn't take, it gives," Rodan replied cryptically. "But it gives what you cannot control. Elric, if you choose this path, you must bind it to yourself. The shadow will enter you, and it will never leave." Elric nodded, his eyes fixed on the sword. "If that's what it takes to stop this, I'll do it." Ignoring the protests of the others, Elric stepped forward and gripped the hilt of the broken blade. Pain shot through him like lightning, and he cried out, his knees buckling. The shadow surged from the altar, coiling around him and plunging into his chest. He gasped as the warmth in his chest became a burning fire, and the shadows settled deep within him. The sword's fragments began to glow, lifting from the altar and reassembling in his hands. The blade was whole again, and its edges gleaming with a dark, otherworldly light. Elric stood, his breathing ragged, but his stance stronger than before. "Elric?" Kata asked cautiously. He turned to face them, his eyes faintly glowing with a soft amber light. "I'm fine," he said, his voice steadier than it had been before. He lifted the Oathbreaker's blade, feeling its weight as though it had always been his. "Have I cursed myself?" Elric asked Rodan. Before Rodan could answer, the air grew cold. The faint whispers that had followed them through the veil rose into a chorus of wails. The shadows around the sepulchre twisted and writhed, forming a figure cloaked in darkness. Its fiery eyes burned as it stepped toward them, and the sword began to glow faintly. The figure's voice was like a dozen voices speaking at once, deep and resonant.
"You tread upon sacred ground, mortals. Why have you come?"
Dane stepped forward, his sword drawn. "We've come to stop you, Oathbreaker, to end this once and for all." The figure chuckled, a hollow, chilling sound.
"Then prove it. You cannot end what I've become. My oath was broken not by my hand alone, but by the lives of those who swore to stand with me."
"You were betrayed?" Lyra asked, her eyes narrowing. "By whom?" Naemor's fiery gaze fixed on her.
"By the very ones who bound me to this land. They cast me into the shadow, thinking they could cleanse their sins. But I endured. I became the shadow.
You've destroyed everything you were meant to protect, Kata said, her voice firm. Your betrayal doesn't justify the destruction you've unleashed.
And yet here you stand,
Namor said, his tone mocking.
Driven by the same oaths and promises that broke me. Do you truly believe that you are different?
We're not you, Elric said, stepping forward despite the weight of the Oathbreaker's gaze. And we won't make the same mistakes. Nameless' form flickered, the shadows around him swirling violently.
Then prove it.
The ground beneath them trembled, and the pillars surrounding the sepulchre came to life, their shattered fragments raising into the air. The shadows solidified into spectral guardians, each wielding weapons of pure darkness. Hold your ground, Kata shouted, raising her shield as the guardians charged. The battle was chaos. Dane met the first guardian head-on, his blade clashing against its shadowy weapon with a resounding clang. Lyra unleashed bolts of lightning from her staff, the energy searing through the spectral form, but failing to destroy them completely. Kale darted between the guardians, his daggers finding weak points in their defenses, while Corrin worked desperately to keep the group healed. Elric found himself locked in combat with a guardian, his sword feeling unwieldy in his hands. Each strike was met with a parry, the force of the blows reverberating through his arms. He was thrown back, landing hard on the ground as the guardian loomed over him. Get up, Kata shouted, intercepting the guardian's strike with her shield. You're stronger than you think, Elric! Rordan, meanwhile, focused his magic on the pillars, chanting an incantation that caused their floating fragments to falter. The pillars are binding him, he shouted. Break them, and we weaken him. With a shared glance, the group shifted their focus. Dane and Kata pushed toward one pillar, their combined strength shattering it with a thunderous crack. Lyra and Kale targeted another, her magic and his precision strikes breaking it apart piece by piece. Elric found himself alongside Rordan, guarding the mage as he worked to collapse the final pillar. As the last pillar crumbled, Nairmor's form flickered violently. His fiery eyes dimmed, and the spectral guardians dissolved into mist.
You think this will stop me?
He roared, his voice filled with rage and pain.
The shadow cannot be undone.
We're not here to undo it, Rordan said, stepping forward. We're here to finish what you started. The Oathbreaker's form began to dissipate, his voice fading into the shadows.
You cannot escape the price. The shadow always takes its due.
As silence fell over the sepulchre, the group stood amidst the ruins, their breaths heavy. The unbroken sword no longer glowed, and the oppressive weight of the shadows had lifted slightly. It's not over, Lyra said quietly. This was only a piece of him. And the necromancer? Corrin asked. Rordan turned toward the citadel in the distance. That's where we find the answers. With weary resolve, the group gathered their strength and set their sights on the next leg of their journey. The Shadow's heart awaited, and with it, the truth of Nairmor's fall. The group exchanged uneasy glances, but nodded. The citadel loomed ahead, and with the Oathbreaker's blade in Elric's hands, their resolve solidified. The weak boy they had known was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone who carried both the light and the shadow within him. The journey to the citadel led the group across a fractured landscape of molten rivers, jagged cliffs, and blackened stone. The ground hissed and cracked beneath their boots, steam rising from fissures that glowed with an ominous red light. Every step closer to the citadel seemed to sap their strength, the oppressive heat and sulfurous air clawing at their resolve. "This is Drakon's Maw," Dane said grimly as the group crested a ridge overlooking the fiery expanse. The molten rivers below twisted like the veins of a wounded beast, and jagged spires of rock jutted from the ground like broken spears. "A Wyrm once ruled here. Some say its fire still burns beneath the earth." "Wonderful," Kale muttered, squinting into the heat haze. "And here I thought things couldn't get worse." "They always can," Rodan replied, his skeletal hand gripping his staff. "The shadow corrupts what it touches. The worm's power may not be gone. It may have been twisted like Nairmore." "Let's hope you're wrong," Kata said, adjusting her shield as she stared down the ridge. "We don't have time for another fight." As they descended into the maw, the heat became nearly unbearable. The air shimmered, distorting their vision, and the ground beneath their feet grew slick with sulfurous deposits. The group moved cautiously, wary of the molten rivers that carved through the landscape. "Do you feel that?" Lyra asked, pausing as her runes began to glow faintly. "Feel what?" Elric asked, his brow furrowed as he scanned the area. Lyra turned toward the largest of the molten rivers, her expression tense. "Magic. Old magic. Something is stirring." The ground trembled beneath them. A deep, guttural roar echoed through the maw. From the largest fissure erupted a column of fire, and from the flames emerged a massive worm, its scales blackened and molten veins like rivers of lava. Its wings, tattered and skeletal, spread wide as it let out a deafening roar that shook the very earth. "Of course," Kale groaned. "But why wouldn't there be a fire-breathing worm?" "It's not just fire," Rodan said, his voice steady despite the situation. "The shadow has taken root in it. Look at its eyes." The worm's gaze burned with crimson light, the same fiery intensity as the archfiend they had faced in Thornmere. Its presence radiated malevolence, and the group could feel the shadow's influence in every movement of the massive creature. "It's guarding the path to the citadel," Dane said, unsheathing his blade. His scarred armor gleamed in the light of the molten rivers. "We have to kill it." "Brilliant plan," Kale said, drawing his daggers. "Just one problem. How do we kill something made of fire?" "Quickly," Kata said, raising her shield. "Form up." The worm struck first, its massive tail whipping toward the group. Kata intercepted the blow with her shield, the impact sending shockwaves through the ground and forcing her to dig her heels in. Dane charged forward, his blade slicing into the creature's side. Though the strike left a gash, molten ichor spilled from the wound and closed almost instantly. "It's regenerating!" Corrin shouted from behind, his hands glowing as he cast a healing spell over the group. "We need to weaken it first!" Lyra's runes flared to life as she unleashed a torrent of ice magic. The flames around the worm dimmed, frost spreading across its molten scales. But the creature roared and shook off the attack, its heat reigniting the frozen surface. "It's resisting magic," Lyra called out. "We need to disrupt the shadow's hold on it." Rodan stepped forward, his emerald shaft glowing brighter than before. He muttered an incantation. The tendrils of green energy lashed out, wrapping around the worm's limbs and wings. The creature struggled, its movement slow as the magic sapped its strength. "I can hold it, but not for long," Rodan shouted. "Strike now!" Dane and Kata moved as one, their blades carving deep into the worm's legs. Gale darted in and out, his daggers finding weak points in the creature's fiery armor. Elric, though hesitant, joined the fray, his sword striking at the worm's tail as it thrashed wildly. The worm let out a guttural roar, its molten flames growing brighter as it unleashed a torrent of fire. The group scattered, barely avoiding the flames. Corrin rushed to Lyra's side, his healing magic stabilizing her as she was grazed by the inferno. "We're wearing it down," Kata called, raising her shield as the worm lunged at her. "Keep pushing!" The turning point came when Rodan's magic latched onto the worm's chest, where a pulsating crimson light burned beneath its molten scales. "The heart!" Rodan shouted. "It's the source of the shadow's power!" Lyra raised her staff, her runes flaring as she summoned all her strength. A beam of concentrated energy struck the worm's chest, cracking the molten scales and exposing the shadow-infused heart beneath. "Now!" she screamed, her voice strained. Dane charged forward, his blade gleaming with Corrin's blessing. A roar of his own, he drove the sword deep into the worm's heart. The creature let out a final deafening scream as the light within it erupted, consuming the worm in a blinding explosion of fire and shadow. When the light faded, the worm's body lay still, its molten veins cooling into obsidian. The oppressive heat of the maw began to dissipate, and the path to the citadel lay open before them. The group stood in the aftermath, their breaths ragged and their bodies battered. "One more monster down," Kale said, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "How many more to go?" "That wasn't just a monster," Lyra said, her expression grim. "It was a guardian. The shadow's influence runs deeper than we thought." Rodan leaned on his staff, his green eyes dimming. "The citadel is close. Whatever lies within, it knows we're coming." Elric stared at the path ahead, the citadel's jagged spires piercing the horizon. He tightened his grip on the sword, the warmth in his chest flaring faintly. "Then we keep going," he said, surprising even himself with the steadiness of his voice. "We've come this far, we can't stop now." The others exchanged glances, their weariness tempered by Elric's resolve. Slowly, they began to move, their footsteps echoing across the cracked ground as they advanced toward the shadow's heart. The citadel awaited. The citadel rose before them like a jagged wound against the ashen sky, its spires twisting unnaturally as if defying the laws of nature. The closer they drew, the heavier the air became, pressing down on their lungs and clouding their thoughts. Shadows slithered along the edges of their vision, whispering faintly but never quite forming words. "This place reeks of death," Dane muttered, his grip tightening on his sword. "It's worse than death," Rodan said, his voice hollow. The green glow of his staff flickered as if strained. "This is corruption. The necromancer's presence taints everything." The group pushed through the immense iron gates of the citadel, which creaked and groaned as they swung inward. Beyond lay a vast chamber bathed in sickly green light. At its center stood a figure cloaked in black, their face hidden beneath a shadowed hood. In one skeletal hand, the necromancer clutched a staff topped with a glowing, blood-red crystal.
"So you've come at last,"
the necromancer said, their voice echoing unnaturally, layered with the tones of 1,000 dead souls.
opposing. Nevermore thought himself strong once too.
You're the one behind this, Kata said, stepping forward, her shield raised. You corrupted Nevermore and unleashed this chaos. It ends here. The necromancer chuckled, the sound like cracking bones.
And you misunderstand, Shield Maiden. There are no ends, only transformations. The shadow is eternal, as am I.
Let's see how eternal you are. Dane growled, charging forward. His blade glowed with Corrin's blessing as he swung for the necromancer's heart. The air between them rippled, and Dane's strike stopped inches from its mark, repelled by an invisible force. The necromancer raised their staff, and a wave of dark energy erupted, sending Dane flying backward.
Fools!
The necromancer hissed.
You cannot harm me here. This place is my sanctuary, built upon the foundation of Nevermore's betrayal.
The shadows around the chamber began to writhe, coalescing into spectral figures armed with jagged weapons. The necromancer raised a hand, and the figures lunged at the group. Hold them off! Kata shouted, intercepting the first strike with her shield. Lyra's runes flared as she unleashed bolts of arcane energy, striking down the spectral forms. Kale darted through the chaos, his daggers finding weak points in the shadowy forms, while Corrin's magic kept the group standing. Rordan's voice rang out above the clamor. The crystal! It's the source of their power!
Elric! It has to be you! Only the Oathbreaker's blade can destroy the stone!
Elric turned his gaze to the necromancer's staff, where the blood-red crystal pulsed like a beating heart. He clenched his jaw, gripped his sword tightly. We need to destroy it. Easier said than done, Kale shouted, narrowly dodging a swipe from a spectral blade. Lyra stepped forward, her staff glowing brightly. I'll create an opening, be ready. She began to chant, her runes glowing with increasing intensity. The air crackled with energy as a beam of pure light erupted from her staff, striking the necromancer's barrier. The force shattered the protective aura, leaving the necromancer momentarily vulnerable. Elric, now! Kata yelled. Summoning all his courage, Elric charged toward the necromancer. The warmth in his chest flared, and the blade glowed faintly as he raised it high. The necromancer turned, their empty gaze locking onto him.
Foolish boy,
they hissed.
You will never.
Elric's strike connected, shattering the crystal in a brilliant explosion of light and shadow. The necromancer screamed, their form writhing as cracks spread across their body. The spectral figures dissolved, and the oppressive weight of the chamber began to lift.
This is not the end.
The necromancer roared, their voice splintering into echoes.
The shadow will rise again.
With a final deafening cry, the necromancer's form exploded into ash, leaving only silence in their wake. The group stood together, their breaths ragged, and they surveyed the empty chamber. The shattered remains of the crystal lay at their feet, its once malevolent glow extinguished. Is it over? Elric asked, his voice trembling. No, Rordan said, his tone heavy. This was only the spell's anchor. The shadow's heart still beats, and Nevermore's will remains. Lyra nodded, her expression grim. But we've weakened it. The necromancer's hold is broken. The group exchanged weary glances, knowing their journey was far from complete. Beyond the chamber, a shadow's heart awaited, pulsing with the echoes of Nevermore's fall. Then we finish it, Kata said, raising her shield. Together. With resolve renewed, they turned toward the darkness ahead, ready to face whatever remained. The path beyond the necromancer's chamber led the group into the citadel's core, a labyrinth of jagged stone and flickering shadows. The oppressive heat of the maw was gone, replaced by a cold that seeped into their very bones. The air carried a faint, rhythmic pulse, like the distant beating of a massive heart. "This place is alive," Lyra whispered, her staff glowing faintly to illuminate the path. "The shadow's essence is woven into it." Rodan nodded solemnly. "This is no citadel. It's a prison, and its warden awaits." As they descended deeper, the pulse grew louder, resonating through the walls and into their chests. Elric felt the warmth of the blade at his side intensify, as though it responded to the rhythm. He glanced at Rodan. "Is it him?" The skeletal mage's green eyes dimmed slightly. "It's Nairmor." The group emerged into a cavernous chamber. The ceiling disappeared into darkness, and the walls were lined with massive broken chains that hung like the remnants of a great struggle. At the center of the chamber stood a raised platform upon which a figure knelt. His armor, once golden and radiant, was tarnished and cracked. His form flickered with shadow, and his head hung low, his fiery eyes dim. "Nairmor," Dane said, his voice heavy with both awe and anger. The figure stirred, rising slowly to his feet. As he turned to face them, the shadows around him coiled and writhed, forming a living shroud. His fiery eyes burned brighter, and his voice rumbled like thunder.
"You should not have come."
"We didn't come to watch you wallow in regret," Kata said, stepping forward with her shield raised. "We came to stop you." The Oathbreaker's gaze swept over the group, his expression unreadable.
"You think you can stop this? The shadow is eternal. I am eternal."
"You weren't always this way," Rodan said, his voice steady but filled with sorrow. "You were Elendor's protector, its champion. What happened to you?" Nairmor's fiery eyes flickered for a moment. The shadows around him seemed to recede. His voice, when he spoke, carried a hint of anguish.
"I was betrayed. My oath was pure, my promise unyielding. But when the darkness came, the Council of Elendor sacrificed me to save themselves. They bound me to the shadow, thinking they could contain it. Instead, they unleashed it."
"You broke your oath," Lyra said, her tone sharp. "You let their betrayal consume you."
"And you would not?"
Nairmor roared, the shadows flaring around him.
"You would not strike down those who used you, cast you aside like a tool? My oath was not broken in my hand alone, it was shattered by theirs."
Elric stepped forward, his voice steady despite the trembling in his legs. "They may have betrayed you, but you had a choice, and now you're doing the same to this world." Nairmor's gaze locked onto Elric, and the warmth in Elric's chest flared in response. The Oathbreaker tilted his head slightly.
"You carry the blade of the Oathbreaker, yet you dare lecture me on choice?"
"I carry it because I won't let the shadow win," Elric said, drawing the blade. Its golden light flared, pushing back the shadows in the chamber. "Because I won't make the same mistakes you did." Nairmor let out a roar, and the chamber trembled. The shadows around him surged, forming massive tendrils that lashed out at the group. Kato raised her shield, deflecting one tendril as Dane charged forward, his blade slashing through another. Lyra unleashed a burst of fire, the flame searing through the darkness, while Kael darted between attacks, his daggers finding weak points in the writhing mass. The Oathbreaker moved with unnatural speed, his corrupted blade meeting Dane's strike in a power of sparks.
You fight well, knight.
Naramor said, his voice filled with a twisted admiration.
But you cannot defeat me. The shadow strengthens me.
Then we'll weaken it, Lyra shouted, her staff glowing brightly as she channeled a spell. Runes flared on the walls of the chamber, and the chains that hung from above began to glow faintly. The chains, Rordan said, his voice rising with urgency. They were used to bind him. If we can restore them...
No!
Naramor bellowed, the shadows around him surging.
You will not bind me again!
The battle intensified as the group split their focus. While Dane and Kata and Kael kept Naramor occupied, Rordran and Lyra worked to reactivate the chains. Corrin moved between them, casting protective wards and healing wounds as the group strained against the Oathbreaker's overwhelming power. Elric! Rordan shouted. The blade! It's the key! Use it to channel the chains! Elric's heart pounded as he dodged a shadowy tendril. He looked at the glowing chains and then to the blade in his hand. The warmth in his chest burned hotter, and he felt the faint echo of Naramor's anguish within him. He sprinted toward the center of the platform, dodging Naramor's attacks as Kata shielded him from a devastating strike. Reaching the base of the chains, Elric raised the blade high, its golden light flaring brighter than ever before. I won't let the shadow take this world, he shouted, driving the blade into the platform. The chains came to life, their light surging through the chamber. They lashed out, wrapping around Naramor's form. The Oathbreaker roared, his fiery eyes blazing as the shadows around him dissipated.
You think this will save you?
He bellowed.
The shadow cannot be destroyed?
The chains tightened, their light overwhelming, and Naramor collapsed to his knees. The shadows dissolved, leaving only the broken figure of a man in tarnished armor. As the light faded, the group stood in silence, their breaths ragged. Naramor knelt before them, his fiery eyes dim. He looked up at Elric, his voice no longer booming, but filled with quiet sorrow.
You have done what I could not,
he said.
But the shadow remains. It always will.
We'll be ready, Elric said, lowering the blade. And this time, it won't consume us. Naramor nodded faintly, his form beginning to fade.
Carry the blade well, Elric of Thornmere, and remember, it is not power that defines a hero, but the choices they make.
With that, the Oathbreaker dissolved into light, leaving the chamber silent once more. The group stood together, the weight of their journey settling over them. The citadel was quiet, but they knew the shadow was not truly gone. We've won a battle, Rordan said, leaning on his staff, but the war is far from over. Elric looked at the blade in his hand. Its golden glow, faint but steady. Then we'll fight, he said, his voice resolute. The group turned and began their ascent from the citadel. Though the shadow's heart had been quelled, the road ahead remained uncertain. Yet together they carried the hope of a world that had nearly been lost, and the strength to face whatever lay ahead. The citadel crumbled behind them, its obsidian spires collapsing into the barren ground with a groan that reverberated through the land. The air, once thick with oppressive weight of the shadow, began to thin, carrying the faintest hint of a cool breeze. For the first time since crossing the veil, the group could breathe deeply, free of the cloying sense of despair that had followed them. The land stretched out before them, still scorched and lifeless in many places, but showing faint signs of change. Here and there, cracks in the blackened earth revealed shoots of green, defiant bursts of life, reclaiming the scarred landscape. Above them, the sky shifted from an ominous crimson to a deep, velvety purple, streaked with the first stars of twilight. The light was soft, almost tender, like the hesitant touch of dawn after a long night. "It's done," Lyra said, her voice quiet and measured. Her runed staff still glowed faintly, though the light flickered as if mirroring her exhaustion. She stared at the horizon, her sharp eyes taking in the slow but undeniable healing of the land. "The chains have bound him. Nevermore cannot rise again." "But the shadow remains," Rodan said, his skeletal form outlined by the faint green glow of his staff. His voice, usually dry and sardonic, carried a note of solemnity. "It lingers, as it always does, cannot be destroyed, only kept at bay." Elric, standing at the center of the group, looked down at the Oathbreaker's blade in his hand. Its golden light, once brilliant and fierce, had dimmed to a faint, steady glow, like the last ember of a dying fire. He tightened his grip on the hilt, feeling the warmth in his chest pulsing in quiet rhythm with the blade. It was a reminder of what they had accomplished and what he now carried. "It's still inside me," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. The others turned to look at him, their expressions a mix of concern and understanding. "The shadow, it hasn't left?" "No," Rodan said, stepping closer. The faint green glow of his eyes flickered, as if dimmed by the weight of his words. "It's bound to you now, just as it was to him. The blade marked you when you took it up, and the shadow saw its chance." Elric looked up, meeting the mage's hollow gaze. "Will it consume me?" Rodan tilted his head slightly, his bony fingers tapping against his staff. "That depends entirely on you. The shadow is patient, boy. It doesn't rage or claw. It waits. It tempts. You'll feel its whispers when you're tired, when you doubt, when you're alone. It will always be there, waiting for you to falter." "And if I don't?" Elric asked, his voice steadier now. Rodan's skeletal grin widened faintly. He had no flesh, but somehow it was clear he was smiling. "Then you'll be something no one else has managed to be, a true wielder of the Oathbreaker's blade." The group began their journey away from the citadel, walking in silence at first. Each step felt lighter than the last, though their bodies were heavy with exhaustion. As they passed through the ruined landscape, the subtle signs of renewal grew more frequent. Grasses pushed stubbornly through the cracked earth, their green blades vivid against the scorched black. Small streams of water, clear and cold, trickled from newly opened springs, carving paths through the ashes. "This land is healing," Corin said, his voice tinged with wonder. The healer knelt by one of the streams, dipping his hand in the cool water. "It's like it remembers what it was before." "It does," Lyra said, pushing to touch the bark of a sapling that had miraculously sprouted nearby. Her runes glowed faintly as she whispered a blessing, and the tree seemed to grow taller before their eyes. "The shadow suppresses, but it doesn't erase. The life of Elendur has always been resilient." "And so are we," Dane said, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. The dragon-scarred knight stood tall, his armor battled but unyielding. We've faced worse than this." "Have we, though?" Cale quipped, his voice laced with his usual sarcasm, though it lacked its sharp edge. "I mean, a cursed protector, a necromancer, a giant fireworm, and all in 1 week. That's a new record for me." Kata chuckled, the sound light but genuine. Let's hope we don't break it." When they reached the edge of the Wyrmsreach, the oppressive weight that had clung to them since their descent lifted entirely. The forest, once twisted and suffocating, had transformed. The gnarled trees stood straighter, their branches reaching skyward as though eager to feel the sun's warmth. Birds sang in the distance, their melodies filling the air with a sense of fragile hope. The group paused at the forest's edge, looking out over the golden fields of Arendor. The horizon stretched endlessly before them, the sunlight painting the land in hues of amber and gold. It was a sight none of them thought they would see again. "It's beautiful," Lyra said softly, her gaze distant. "And hard won," Kata added, her shield slung across her back. "Don't forget that." As the group began to part ways, the reality of their journey's end settled over them. One by one, they exchanged words of farewell, their bonds unspoken but unbroken. "Think you'll miss me?" Cale asked, his grin returning as he turned to Kata. "It's not every day you meet a rogue as charming as I am." "Miss you?" Kata said, raising an eyebrow. "I'll be glad to have some peace and quiet." They laughed, the sound cutting through the weight of the moment, and Cale gave her a playful salute before disappearing into the trees. Elric lingered at the edge of the forest, staring out at the horizon. The warmth of the blade in his hand pulsed faintly, a reminder of the shadow he carried and the choice he had made. He felt the weight of Rordan's gaze on him and turned to see the skeletal mage watching him. "You'll have your work cut out for you," Rordan said, his tone half amused, half serious. "The shadow doesn't rest." "Neither will I," Elric said firmly. Rordan inclined his head, a faint smile playing across his skeletal features. "Good answer." The mage turned and began to walk away, his staff glowing faintly as he disappeared into the forest shadows. Elric watched him go, then turned back to the horizon. He thought of Thornmere, of the life that he had left behind. The boy who had once leaned against the village well, content in his small world, was gone. In his place stood someone who had faced the darkness and refused to let it win. He carried the shadow's mark, but he also carried hope. With a deep breath, Elric stepped into the golden fields, the warmth of the sun on his face, and the weight of the blade at his side. The shadow still lingered somewhere in the far reaches of the world, waiting for its moment. But when that moment came, Elric knew he would be ready. For he was not just a boy from Thornmere, he was the protector of a world that refused to fall. And as he walked toward the rising sun, the shadows in the distance grew smaller, but watched and plotted.